Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm pleased to welcome you all to today's event, Post-Paris Download, the UN Climate Negotiations, and What's Next for Climate Action, co-sponsored by the Center for Global Sustainability and the Undergraduate Sustainability Studies minor. My name's Eric Hoffman, and I'm an advisor for the Sustainability Studies minor, as well as a student in the School of Public Policy and the Conservation Biology program. We have a really excellent panel today, many of which were present at the Paris COP21 negotiations, which were the most recent round of talks on climate change at the United Nations. And so it's my pleasure to introduce the panel, and then I'll pass it off to today's moderator. But to start, we'll first hear from Dr. Robert Orr, who serves as the Dean at the Maryland School of Public Policy and the United Nations Under Secretary General. He also serves as a special advisor to the United Nations Secretary General on Climate Change and was a principal architect of the Paris conference. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Anand Patwardhan, who's a professor of environmental policy at the Maryland School of Public Policy, and he has been a coordinating lead author for the 4th and 5th assessment reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Dana Fisher, who's a professor of sociology and the director of the Program for Society and Environment at UMD. Dr. Fisher's research focuses on understanding the relationship between environmentalism and democracy, most recently studying environmental stewardship, American climate politics, and the role of civil society in global climate debates. And our last panelist will be Dr. Nathan Hultman, who's the director of the new Center for Global Sustainability here on campus, and is an associate professor at the School of Public Policy. He recently served as Deputy Associate Director for Energy and Climate Change within the White House Council on Environmental Quality, where he worked on the U.S. climate target and the Paris climate negotiations. And then finally, it's my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, who's going to take over from here, Dr. Jennifer Haddon, who is currently a fellow with the Council on Foreign Relations, working at the U.S. State Department in the Office of the Special Envoy for Climate Change. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Government and Politics at UMD, and the author of a recent book on the role of stakeholder participation in global climate governance. So please join me in welcoming the panel.
All right, thank you so much, Eric, for that kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here today and for organizing such an interesting group of people to get together to discuss at what I think is really a critical juncture, because as you guys all know, at this point we've moved past the point of negotiating the Paris Agreement, and we're starting to think about what did the Paris Agreement get us, where are we in terms of moving towards implementation. And I think all 4 of the panelists today are really well positioned to come at this issue from different angles. So in terms of format, we're going to have each of the panelists first give introductory remarks, then I'll pose some questions to them, and then we'd really like to leave lots of time to have audience questions to the panelists. So with that said, I'll first pass it off to Dean Orr.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to the center and the minor for organizing this. I looked at the title of the event today, and I thought, I wonder how much longer we're going to be talking about Paris and post-Paris. How long will that remain the reference point for this discussion? There's actually, I think, 2 different counter trends for why Paris is the reference point and will probably remain a reference point for some time. Most international agreements, when they are struck, start getting undermined the minute after they are struck. Everyone's unhappy with what came out. They didn't get quite as much as they wanted. So people start talking it down. So the normal trajectory of international agreements is the high point is when it's struck, and after that it starts to degrade. The half-life can be precipitous, or it can be a little less precipitous, but that's the norm. In this case, the Paris Agreement is still in very good it's not decaying yet. It's considered a excellent agreement by the parties who struck it, by those who are observers to the agreement, and by a whole range of constituencies that would be needed to sustain it. This is unusual, and it's very positive. On the other hand, you have pressures on this brand new agreement. The question started almost immediately with the Supreme Court stay on the Clean Power Plan there are immediately international questions about, can the United States deliver? And that will be a theme that you will hear through this presidential campaign around the world. Can the United States deliver, given our political system, given the commitments made by one administration? Will it survive? Now, multiply that by 196, all the parties to this agreement. Politics are real in every country, and you will have at any given point of this agreement, some countries will be moving the wrong direction, and some will be moving the right direction. And any agreement to be able to be sustainable has to be able to keep an equilibrium among those parties, even when politics in their home countries start to move in the wrong direction. Now, the truth is the United States is not just one of 196. The world's second largest emitter, and clearly one of the countries with the most capabilities to support this agreement through private means, through public means, through political means. So we can't take lightly the Supreme Court stay. That said, if you look at the fundamentals, the United States has calculated its agreement with this agreement and its ability to deliver not just on the commitment of one administration, but on market forces, on trends that are already in play. Just interestingly, I was in Houston, Texas a few weeks ago for the large CERAWeek conference, which is the big energy conference every year for the last 35 years. It's oil, it's gas, it's natural gas, it's solar, it's wind. You see all the sources of energy there. And I will tell you, among the energy industry globally, meeting in Houston, Texas, the capital of oil, the assumption was that this agreement did presage a new era in energy. That they would look at market forces, but that this was more a reflection of what's happening, not that it was going to change everything, but that it reflected that things were already changing. And interestingly, since that time, the newspapers have been filled with news of U.S. coal companies going bankrupt. It's already been happening for years now. Now, I think the largest coal company, Peabody, is in some dire circumstances. So market forces are speaking. And then come just a couple days ago, Tesla's announcement of the less expensive Tesla car, and 200,000 Americans put $1,000 down to reserve the possibility to get a car 18 months from now. Note, this has never happened with any car in the history of making cars. That is a very good sign that there are markets both for new technologies and for renewables, and negative markets for some of the oldest, dirtiest sources of energy. So you have these conflicting trends. This same thing is happening in other countries. And what the Paris Agreement, why it's so important, is that the marketplace for the economics and the politics meet under the Paris umbrella. It was extremely significant this past week that the President of the United States and the President of China, on the margins of a nuclear security summit, talked about and then jointly announced their full support, and that they would be signing this new agreement on the first day it is open for signature on April 22nd in New York City. That is significant that the two largest emitters, the two largest sources of the problem and the solution, are saying we will continue to work together, we'll do so in the marketplace, and we'll do so in the political world. I think that is an important backdrop, but I think in a minute you'll hear from some of our other panelists who have, I think, very important viewpoints on key aspects of this agreement. And I won't put any words in Dana's mouth, but I want you to ask her if she doesn't say anything about the public mobilization piece of this equation. One is, yeah, she's there. I knew I could count on her. The bottom line is that this is not all happening in a vacuum. Yes, there are market forces. There are also political market forces. The people have mobilized around the globe, not just around this agreement, but around a transformative climate agenda. And it is starting to impact politics in virtually every country. And that is something that I don't see changing anytime soon. In fact, I think if it changes, it'll only change to make it a much sharper curve. It'll be even stronger reaction as we see some of the more negative impacts of climate change hitting in various parts of the globe. So I remain very bullish on the Paris Agreement, that this is a fundamentally not only a sound agreement, but a very good agreement, that we have all the fundamentals in place, and now it's the hard work of implementing it and continuing to bring in all the innovation into this space. The last word I would say by way of introduction is the climate action space, what has been called climate action, which originally began outside the negotiating space. Negotiations were for governments, and climate action was for everyone else. That was businesses, that was individuals, that was civil society, that was media. They were all out there. If you look at the climate agreement in Paris, for the first time, climate action is brought in-house. It's part of the agreement. Businesses that have made commitments, finance, private finance as well as public, is now endogenous to this system. We all have to wait and see how that's going to work, but that is fundamentally different than everything that comes before, and the opposite of what happened in Kyoto and after Kyoto. So this is very different. We have all these constituencies mobilizing, and next month, here in Washington, D.C., we will see at Climate Action 2016 that these coalitions are not only still alive after Paris, they're growing, they're deepening, they're broadening, and that in the sectoral areas where we most need progress, the land use, the energy systems, the cities, you will see coalition after coalition coming to the microphone saying we've added this many more partners, this much more capital. So I think that now that we have this climate action model inside the agreement, inside the system, and it's growing and it's morphing in a positive direction, I think this is all to the good. I would conclude with just one observation about the importance of starting at the right end of the equation, which is what do we have to do? It's great that we're doing all this and we're getting movement, and we can be very positive that we're doing things we've never done before. But with Anand sitting right next to me, I have to say, the science still tells us we're in a lot of trouble. So even as we're saying we have all this positive momentum, we have a good agreement, we have these coalitions, we are in a race against time. And we are not winning that race. We have to move faster, further, harder, and the pressure has to be not only maintained but even ratcheted up. So there's a one-way ratchet mechanism on this agreement, which is there's a certain level of ambition built into it. It's an ambitious agreement, but the commitments made thus far under the INDC system, and I think Nate may say something about that, do not add up to where we need to be. So we need to focus on these parts of this wonderful new system we've built to make sure that the ratchet mechanism is used, and it's used aggressively to make sure we get more ambitious, not next year, not in 2020, but right now. And I think that will get us to where the science tells us we have to go. Until now, we've had kind of a dialogue of the deaf of the scientists on one side saying, you know, just how many problems we have and what we have to do, and then economic and political actors saying we just can't get there, so let's talk about what we can do. We're now in the same space, but that doesn't mean that it will just naturally come to an equilibrium. So we need to maintain not just vigilance, but extremely active interest in using all these new tools we have, these new coalitions, and this new structure. I hand back to you, or just hand down the...
Just hand down the mic. Thanks, thanks, Jennifer, and happy to be here. I guess what I will do is sort of follow on a little bit from Bob's remarks, and perhaps more from a developing country perspective about the significance of Paris. And then I do have a couple of cautionary words at the end. So I think, let me start by sort of suggesting what I think is the real significance of Paris. And the real significance is that for the first time we have a universal agreement about how we should act, not just about the what we should do. because the what's already there. If you look at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is in fact the first universally ratified agreement, including by the US, it does spell out what we should do, although not, I must say, in exact detail, but it's really about the how. And the how matters, because ultimately when it comes to action, you have to figure out, we have to have agreement on how we should act, who should do what, how should we share the burden, who's responsible, right? So I think in that sense, that is the significance. It does that, and it also in some sense picks up the other important bit of the convention, which is about the principles that should underlie those actions. So it's not just about how we should do things, but how should those actions be guided by? What should be the principles that guide those actions? And which is really the core, in a sense, of the convention, is the common but differentiated responsibility, respective capacity. So the CBDR term, which for the developing world is really a central part of the convention as much as the objective itself. So why does this matter? It matters because the first time we tried to figure out how to implement the convention, we got the Berlin Mandate, which got us Kyoto. And Kyoto followed a top-down approach of setting targets and timetables. And it also adopted a very hard, rigid approach to how do we operationalize this principle of common but differentiated responsibility in the form of annexes. And of course, Kyoto was a non-starter in the US, and the US was the largest GHG emitter at the time, so obviously that's a problem. For a good chunk of the time since then, the effort really was to find a formulation that would get the US on board, and which sort of got you to the Bali Action Plan, which was this two-track approach. We said, well, for the developing world, let's try and somehow keep Kyoto alive. We like it, we like the formulation in there, but then let's add a second track where everyone would act. It would not just be a set of countries. Eventually, of course, as we know, the Kyoto part atrophied and eventually disappeared. So now we have the Paris Agreement. So from a developing country perspective, the significance of Paris is that while it does break the differentiation as far as action is concerned, right? So all parties have made commitments to act and have reflected those in their INDCs. It does maintain the differentiation between developed and developing countries as far as the provision of means of implementation, because we know that these actions will require finance and technology. So it does maintain that differentiation. And it also actually introduces a couple of new features, which I think will be even more important in the years to come. Aspects like loss and damage. How do we deal with communities and countries that cannot adapt and that suffer losses because of climate change? How do we deal with the problem of displacement of people, climate-induced migration? So I think there are some elements in there which I think are new and which I think will become even more important in the years to come, especially, not only if we meet the 2-degree goal, but certainly if we don't meet it, they'll need to be figured out. So with that sort of significance out of the way, I did want to touch on a couple of other sort of maybe more cautionary points. And the first is about the target, right? So a lot was made about the fact that we said, let's go well below 2 degrees. And this increase in ambition is good, but we should not forget that the IPCC AR5, which basically made the case for increasing that ambition, also made it very clear that every temperature target corresponds to a carbon budget. And so when you pick a temperature goal, you also pick a budget. And the budget is a physical quantity. Now, of course, we can get creative with accounting and do deficit financing, but unfortunately, nature might not take too kindly to overdrawing on the budget. She's not quite someone you can negotiate with there. And so the more stringent the target and the more certain we want to be of meeting that target, the lesser the budget we have. So just to give you a sense, if, for example, we wanted a 50% chance of staying below 2 degrees, we could continue at current levels of global emissions for about 3 decades. If you want to have the same chance of success of staying below 1.5 degrees, we're only about a decade of continuing at current emissions. And given that much of the budget is already gone, it's exhausted with historical emissions, this creates a real challenge because you've got very little space left, and how do you make sure that countries get access to that fair space. So I think that's one sort of cautionary point I wanted to bring. And the other point is really about the political economy of decarbonization. And Bob talked about the fact that we are now, that market trends are pointing towards sort of this transition to a clean energy future. And that to me is creative destruction in the fullest sense of Schumpeter. Right? So any kind of large-scale transition is going to create winners and losers, is going to create opportunities for loss, but also opportunities for profit. And so in some ways, the question really is, how will these benefits and costs be shared? Where will that wealth creation that comes from this clean energy transition go? And will it happen in a way that also addresses poverty and inequality and health and other pressing local environmental issues? Because otherwise, we run the risk that problems in the developing world, both of development and environment, that are very pressing will tend to get crowded out. And that we see that already happening. So that's sort of a second cautionary point I wanted to leave you with.
Wait, no, wait. Hello? Okay, there we go. Just to push really hard. All right, so hello everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm going to take a very different perspective here because I was tasked with talking about civil society, and what I'm going to do is provide some insights coming from a paper that I'm just finishing up called "From Insiders to Outsiders: Civil Society's Shifting Role Within the Global Climate Regime." So it starts right before Paris, and on the evening of Friday, the 13th of November 2015, a set of coordinated terrorist attacks hit the city of Paris, leaving 130 people dead and hundreds wounded. Directly following the attacks, the French government declared a state of emergency for the entire country, which was extended for 3 months. The state of emergency increased the powers of the French police and security forces, as well as limiting the civil liberties of French society. As a result, police banned public gatherings and marches in Paris. And that included the 2 large-scale marches that had been scheduled to take place at the beginning and the end of the COP21 round of negotiations last winter, fallish. But even before the terrorist attacks happened and the subsequent limitations on civil liberties in France, the climate negotiations in Paris were expected to check the capacity of civil society actors to engage in civil disobedience and other politically potentially disruptive forms of participation at the negotiations. The terrorist attack in Paris accelerated what I call the disenfranchisement of civil society, which I've talked about before. And this recent work contextualizes constraints placed on civil society actors in Paris within a broader analysis about the shifting role of civil society within the climate regime. And this, I think, is particularly situated within an expanding and radicalizing climate movement that we see around the world today, that is interacting with the political exigencies of a strained regime that needs to prove itself both relevant and effective. So what I then wanted to do is just talk about the ways that civil society is being squeezed out of the climate regime. And as most of you know, civil society has participated from the beginning, from when the UNFCCC was originally drafted in 1992 at the UNCED meeting in Brazil. But the thing is that the way that civil society has participated has changed quite substantially. Beginning in the Copenhagen round of the negotiations in 2009, which is COP15, NGO observers were blocked from participation during the final days of the events. I'm loud enough. Can anybody not hear me? Is it just recording? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. I apologize. I'm not that loud. Okay, fine. Anyway, so many people were actually, civil society actors were actually escorted out of the negotiations during the final days of the Copenhagen negotiations. And many civil society actors documented waiting in lines for over a day and then being revoked and not allowed even to come in, so that even though they had been credentialed, they were not allowed to participate. What I think is quite interesting is if you look at the NGO observer percentage in each of the climate negotiations since the climate negotiations COP6 in 2000 in The Hague in the Netherlands, the participation rate has gone down consistently across the board, except for in Copenhagen. So that while in 2000, NGO participation was at 51% of all participants at the negotiations, in Paris it was only 21%. And this is quite substantial and significant. And there are lots of other variables and lots of other things that we can talk about with relation to that percentage, but it's very indicative of the shifting role that civil society is playing. At the same time that access is being limited inside the negotiations, the movement is expanding. And what happens because the movement is expanding and it's being denied access is that more radicalized tactics are being adapted. We have not seen the adoption of these tactics to its full extent because of what happened in Paris. But originally, the largest, I had it written down here, the largest act of civil disobedience within this climate movement ever was scheduled to take place in Paris. And it was canceled because people were not allowed to participate. They were not allowed to protest, they were not allowed to demonstrate, and they were not allowed to come together and gather at all. So instead, there was the shoe demonstration, which people probably saw. Place de la République was covered with 10,000 shoes, including shoes representing the Pope. And that was to symbolize all the people who were planning on marching. Now, there's no question that much of the marching would have turned to civil disobedience because that was what was planned, but none of it happened. And there were a lot of other symbolic forms of social protest that were scheduled to take place, and those that were the most benign and the most unthreatening to the French regime were allowed to happen. However, that type of participation is not going to happen. It is just going to continue to expand and change and shift in ways that the governments will not be able to predict in many cases. So the level of police repression, there's no question that it played a role in the ways that people mobilized and the ways that they actually participated in Paris and at the negotiations in Paris. But as the movement expands, what we're going to see is that when the negotiations come to places where citizens are granted a wide range of civil liberties, like France has when they haven't just experienced a terrorist attack, we're going to see much broader ranges of ways that citizens are going to try to participate and influence what's going on inside negotiations. And I'll just add one other point, which is the research that I've done with many colleagues here at the University of Maryland from the People's Climate March in New York City, shows the ways that the movement is expanding, which is not to say that it's necessarily radicalizing in total, but it is expanding and bringing in people who never before participated in climate types of forms of mobilization around climate. And what we actually found in New York City in September 2014 was that 37% of all of the 400+ thousand participants at the march in New York were new to protest and demonstration overall. Moreover, of the 63% who had actually participated in some form of protest before, over half of them reported that they had never before participated in anything around the climate, and anything around climate change particularly. And what we found is that based on what was the protest du jour, if you will, of different points in time when they were young, when they had been more active, they participated in those forms of protest. And I would predict and hypothesize that what we're going to see in the coming years is that climate is going to be the mobilizing force that brings people out to express their interests and concerns. And that particularly if political action is slow and the effects of climate change become increasingly more tangible, we're going to see this more and more. And there's no question that it will radicalize as voices are not necessarily heard throughout the political process. So what I'm concluding in my work, and what I'll conclude here, is just to say that disenfranchisement of civil society is going to increase, and as it does, so will radicalization and civil disobedience. But I think it's just important to note here that while we see a lot of people showing interest and concern in the issue of climate, we also are in the process of an election right now, an election year. And if you look at polls and you look at people's concern about climate and climate issues, and those who are actually coming out to participate in primaries as well as participating in a general election eventually, there may be a very interesting disconnect between what we see around the climate movement and what we see in the broader populace. And that will also lead to some very interesting challenges in the future. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Dana. That is actually, it's very fascinating work, and it sort of highlighting the challenge of what we're going to be seeing, part of the set of challenges that I think the other speakers have also identified. I was one of the people locked out in Copenhagen, so I feel the pain, and maybe decide that I wasn't going to miss Paris, which I didn't. So I also wanted to say, as long as I've got the mic, to thank you to Jennifer for coming out. Jennifer's got a big job at State Department and is working in this field right now, but also is on leave from her job here at the University of Maryland as a faculty member in government and politics. So thank you for coming out and helping us with this. I hope we can, when you're back, get you to come back and talk about some of your research stuff as well on stakeholders and climate change. I think that would be really fascinating. So let me transition back to what I was going to say. So mindful that we have a limited time and that I would very much like to encourage conversation with our moderator, I'm going to try to keep my comments short. Couple of points. First, I want to amplify a little bit on what Bob said about the kind of change we've seen. It's sometimes, for those of us who've been in the field longer, it's maybe easier to see, but if you're coming into the field, it might not be as obvious. But I want to just mention a couple of really interesting points. First point, in 2008, let's talk US politics briefly. 2008, the two US presidential candidates, Barack Obama and John McCain, both believed in the science of climate change. They both believed that it was a national threat to the United States. They both believed that we should do something about it, and they both believed that we should do a cap and trade in this country in order to deliver the reductions necessary to accomplish that goal. Now, everything fell apart after that, right? So it all changed. It was all quite different. But I want to note that, just so people don't forget, it was not that long ago. It was 8 years ago. This country was essentially ready to do a cap and trade, and it changed. And this actually goes to the pendulum that Bob mentioned, but my point here is the pendulum does swing the other way sometimes. So let's not despair about the US for a moment. So that's one point. Second point, 2009, the year after that, where were we? That was the year of Copenhagen. It was, by almost all kind of agreement, it was a pretty much terrible meeting. And it nearly collapsed, but we did get one small germ of progress out of Copenhagen that later became Paris. I'm not going to go into that right now, but I want to note a couple of things. In 2009 in the US, it looked like our emissions were going to be increasing by 5% by 2020. Okay? In 2009, the Kyoto Protocol, which was the primary vehicle to cover emissions internationally, covered only 30% of global emissions, a number that was dropping every year. So in other words, trying to address a global problem with an agreement that only covered 30%. So that was another problem. There was a very distinct lack of leadership by the US and China and a number of other big emitters. The Europeans were there, and they were certainly acting, and the number of people outside of the governmental regime, like people in civil society and business, were certainly there and acting, but we had a distinct lack of leadership at that time. That did, in fact, change. So now we have 2015, 2016, where did we come? Well, let's see. First thing I mentioned was US emissions. We thought they were going to be 5% above 2005 levels by 2020. We are on track to hit 17% below 2005 levels by 2020. That is because the president took on a commitment after Copenhagen to hit that target of 17% below 2005 levels by 2020. And I want to double down on this a little bit for people who think the US isn't like sort of carrying its weight, and you can hear the echo of my previous job here. I'm not speaking as a representative of the administration at this point, but I do feel pretty strongly about this. The president took on this commitment in Copenhagen thinking that we would have a cap and trade in place. We did not end up having that piece of legislation, so this was all done with regulatory action. Return to this in just a sec. And in addition, we did not have the roughly 1,000 million metric tons, 1 billion metric tons of international offsets we thought we would have under the legislation that was pending. So all of this action had been done by the United States with regulatory action to hit our 2020 target, okay, in absence of legislation. So we've taken that commitment. We're actually on track to hit that. Clean Power Plan is a moving piece, but it's by no means the only or the biggest piece of that puzzle. So we're on track to hit that goal. That's progress at the national level. Progress internationally, we've heard a lot about the Paris Agreement, and I want to mention that we do now have we do now have a structure that allows countries to put down targets that they've established at the national level into this international architecture, okay? And that strengthens the ability of these countries to have confidence that they can set the target and then ideally deliver on the target because it matches with their own national priorities. And a third thing is that unlike 30% of emissions being covered, we now have a regime that essentially covers 100% of emissions, sort of depending on how you count it. But at the very least, the INDCs, the national targets, cover nearly 100% of emissions, 180 parties plus pledging to this regime. A specific element that I did mention about 2009 that also has changed is not only just leadership at the national level, but partnership across governments. And I think the most salient example of this that I can think of, and again, I was involved, so I'm biased, but I do believe that, in November 2014, the United States and China jointly appeared, the President Barack Obama, along with President Xi, appeared in Beijing, and basically put down our targets on the table. It was a surprise, it didn't leak, everybody was pleasantly, I hope, surprised by the news, and it made a big splash internationally. It was the moment I would assert that the idea of national target setting under the Paris regime became concrete. And national governments around the world looked to their own internal processes to see what can we also deliver. It started a race, maybe not quite to the top, but it certainly started a race to see what could be delivered under this new regime. So those are all kind of to the good. That's all sort of retrospective, looking at where we got to with Paris, and sort of sounding a note of optimism on that front. Second point that I'll make briefly. We mentioned Clean Power Plan. I'm happy to return to this if there are questions on it. First of all, Clean Power Plan, as you all know, it's the primary vehicle that the administration has used to deliver prospective reductions in our electricity sector. I want to note that is an important part of the President's overall approach to delivering on our 2025 number, which I was personally kind of involved in setting up and helping sort of figure out. But by no means is the Clean Power Plan the only way we're going to reach our 2025 target. These targets are, in fact, any ambitious target has to be predicated on action across all sectors and all gases. Okay, you can't just focus on electricity and say I'm done. In addition, in the US, we have multiple ways to get at electricity. So Clean Power Plan is the biggest chunk, representing something like 6 gigatons of cumulative reductions by 2030. But we have a number of other actions that we're taking. Again, I can return to the CPP. Administration perspective on this is that this is likely to survive the challenge, but we can discuss the subtleties of that if interested. But we also have things like appliance and equipment efficiency standards, 3 gigatons of cumulative reductions to 2030. We have vehicle fuel efficiency standards for light-duty vehicles, 6 gigatons of cumulative emissions to 2030. We have a new round of heavy-duty vehicle emission standards, which will add another 1 gigaton of cumulative emissions reductions to 2030. We have reductions in improvements in energy efficiency from buildings and residential commercial buildings. We have potentially huge reductions from HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, the replacements for CFCs that we're now proposing to also phase out under the Montreal Protocol this year. And action on this, by the way, by you all, can help dramatically because phasing out HFCs under the Montreal Protocol can account for almost a half a degree of temperature change reduction in the global context. We're talking about 2-degree target, so half a degree is very, very helpful. And finally, in the US, methane. Methane is a huge contributor to our greenhouse gas emissions. It's an area that hasn't been regulated heavily up to now. So there's a lot of other pieces of the puzzle that will go into delivery of the US target. So I'll just leave that at that, and we can return to that in Q&A. I could speak a little bit about Anand's point to the 2 degrees being a challenge, and all I'll do is say, yes, that's right. And Bob and Anand both mentioned the kind of scope of the challenge. Countries have put down, in the US case, 2025, in other countries' cases, 2030. Let me just qualitatively emphasize this point, and I don't have slides or won't sort of talk people through it, but in order for us to hit the 2-degree, or if optimistic, the less than 2-degree, the 1.5-degree targets, action after 2030 or even before 2030 has to accelerate so that essentially all countries, or nearly all countries internationally, are reducing their emissions at a rate that is nearly at the top rate that we've observed for decarbonization globally. So in other words, it has to be not just sort of a single example of Denmark doing a great job, but everybody doing what Denmark has done year in, year out deploying thousands and thousands of new devices, wind turbines, nuclear power plants, and what have you, for essentially a sort of roughly 50-year period. So it's a staggering scope of, a staggering scale of deployment, but it's also one that shouldn't be seen as impossible because we've done dramatic transitions before. And of course, as Bob mentioned about market forces, if in fact the devices that we're talking about are better and cheaper than the devices they're replacing, then we can do it. And so I'll leave it at that, and we can go back to Jennifer.
Well, thank you so much to, is this on? Yeah, thank you so much to everyone for those interesting introductory remarks. In particular, Dean Orr, I was very interested that you returned to this idea about the importance of market signals, because I recall when you first came, you gave a very inspiring speech about how that needed to be one of the outcomes of the Paris Agreement, and so it's great to return to that theme here. And I think what's really interesting for me is to have a reflection on what are the opportunities and challenges that remain in this area. So domestically, we've seen some interesting developments like the American Business Act on Climate, but I'm wondering if you can give us a little bit more insight into what we need to do in order to ensure that those kinds of market signals penetrate all sectors of the economy, and also that they spread to the major developing economies. So what's the next step in ensuring that these signals really get heard?
In the 21st century kind of public-private marketplace, market signals aren't just purely market signals. One of the most encouraging developments about where these markets are coming from is that the engagement of so-called subnational actors, the mayors, even those kind of submayoral as well as governors of states, control both regulatory frameworks but also market-based incentive frameworks that can produce very fast change. One area that we have totally invested in is energy efficiency. We can make the biggest, fastest gains in the energy area not in producing new clean energy, but in consuming less dirty energy. And so I would say we are primed for a revolution in energy efficiency globally. Even take an efficient economy like the German economy or the Japanese economy or the US economy with resources, you still have to do retrofitting to really get aggressive drops in energy efficiency. If you're looking at India or China, bringing on loads of new buildings, loads of new infrastructure, your ability to build in efficiency and make it cost effective is much higher. So this is the proverbial development leapfrog opportunity. And here is where I've tried to get US politicians to focus not on what they perceived to be the threat 5 or 10 years ago, which was a China that wouldn't do enough, but to start thinking about, in a competitive framework, what about a China that does a lot more than we do? They will be more efficient as they bring on more clean, energy-efficient infrastructure, and where does that leave U.S. manufacturers, U.S. building producers? And I think that positive competition, Nate used the term race to the top or race to the almost top. There are a lot of races to the top that we can spur, and it doesn't take public policy that we've never seen before. We just need to take some of these models of incentivizing at the local level, at the state level, at the national level, and get some of these competitions. What I do see happening, and this was happening in stark relief in Houston during this energy meeting, it was a marketplace for the cleanest, cheapest, fastest solutions, and everyone was looking for them. There were companies from all over, all over the world looking for those technologies, but also not just the technologies, the systems. So you had all the electricity distributors, not just the producers there. That marketplace is influenced by public policy at local, state, federal, and international levels. So it's I think the real alchemy to doing this faster and more aggressively is in looking at where it's working and not just accepting that it will evolve at normal market force pace. Incentivize it. And what we see very quickly, if you look at kind of the electric vehicle revolution, you do have some initial incentives those can get overtaken by market forces very quickly. Same, though, I would say, on energy efficiency. And that's before we even get to other sectors like land use. That just the number of, or the amount of emissions that we are needlessly spewing into the environment, we can actually make more efficient production of land and more efficient production and use of energy. This can be money saving. And so it's not just that you're doing the right thing, you're doing the smart thing economically. So it won't just happen on its own. We can't just wait for markets to kick in. We need good public policy to get the virtuous cycle started in various sectors. But once you start it, it does have a self-sustaining capacity.
All right, thank you. I wanted to next pose a question to Dr. Fisher regarding the changing role of civil society participation. One of the things that was really striking to me, looking from the UN Climate Week and then to the Paris Summit, was that there had been an attempt to institutionalize non-state actors in some important ways, which in some ways may be a counterpoint or may be contributing to the things that you're discussing here. So for example, at the Paris meeting, there were daily non-state actor tracks where non-state actors would make major commitments on climate change, they would make major announcements, networking opportunities, and all of these things, which were at least aimed to integrate these non-state actors and to make them in what was called the fourth pillar of the climate agreement. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to how that trend relates to some of the things that you're observing in other areas.
That's a really good question. Thank you for bringing it up. I think that the regime is trying very hard to try to integrate in non-state actors. The problem is there are so many non-state actors, and I think as concern increases, non-state actors explode, you know, not actually explode, but rather the numbers explode. So that it's just not, I mean, we saw this in the Bella Center in Copenhagen. It's not possible to accommodate all the interests inside the climate negotiations. That's part of the reason that there are fewer people being allowed in and it's harder to get credentials for NGO participants. So I understand the challenge there, and I think that it's nice. It's a nice opportunity to try to bring in some meaningful engagement with this fourth pillar. The problem is I just don't think it's possible. And what a lot of the environmental NGOs are saying is they feel like these are these highly institutionalized, heavily funded groups who get to have a say at the table, at least as this fourth pillar, and everybody's left outside in the cold. And because of that, I think that there is this potential fissure starting within the environmental movement itself and in the climate movement itself. I think that as it was, the climate justice movement and the climate movement were already having challenges because they felt that there were different tactics that were necessary, and there's going to be even more of those tensions. And I think that's going to become more and more an issue as we see what they call the front lines of climate change, where there are people who are most at risk from developing countries, but also from poor communities, et cetera. But I think that's something we have to keep our eye on, definitely.
Great, thank you. And let me just ask one more question before we open it up to the audience. Dr. Patwardhan and Dr. Hultman both emphasized that there are both opportunities but major challenges associated with trying to stay well below 2 degrees. I'm wondering if you both might offer a reflection. Say we take up this challenge. Say we get serious about this and we really want to prioritize this pathway. As a student, maybe entering the employment market, where do you think are the biggest leverage points? Where are the most important points to be putting your energy in the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years? And that's a tough question.
Thanks. That is a tough question. I mean, so two quick thoughts. One is, I think the greatest, what shall I say, speed of action will be where you see a confluence between climate and the development agenda, right? And Bob talked about the fact that in the developing world you have a different problem than the developed world. You have a greenfield problem versus a retrofit problem. And the greenfield problem is really all about how do we get new cities built, how do we get new infrastructure built, how do we get energy services delivered, how do we do clean cooking in a way that supports multiple objectives. So I think, to me, one very practical implication of that is anyone who is in IDEV should really be thinking very hard about energy and environment issues, and vice versa, right? So that's one. The other, I think, area is really around resilience, because one of the things that you start seeing now is you start seeing communities already dealing with the consequences of climate change, right? So this is not about 2050 or 2100. This is about the next decade. So I think the whole area of how do we build greater resilience again, that's a direct intersection of the climate and the development agenda. So I think that's where I would really look for places to focus on.
And just even doubling down on that kind of concept of climate being a kind of all-pervasive element in some ways of a lot of the work that you all will be doing. And so whether it's on the kind of technology and energy side, whether it's on the technology or energy side, or it's on the resilience side, number one, there will be a space and a demand for skills that understand the kind of bigger picture here with respect to climate and the kind of need for low carbon energy transitions. And similarly on the resilience piece, thinking in terms of new models of how to relate natural hazards and resilience dimension to climate with the activities of governance at all levels, and even at operations of non-governmental organizations, whether private or public sector type oriented. In more specifically, so that's just kind of to say it'll be everywhere, and so be aware of the issues and be able to deploy those skills in your job. If you're interested really in diving into these areas in particular, I mean, it is, like I said, all pervasive. So it really is, there will be roles in, federal government, state government, local government, in the private sector, in NGOs. The good news in some ways is that, there will be a lot more diversity and diversification in those roles. So even if you're not coming in and thinking I'm an, focused energy person, if you're a communications person, for example, there will be plenty for you to do still in those organizations with that skill set that you have. So it really is, again, all around. I think I want to pull in Dean Orr's earlier comment about, he used the example of Tesla, for example, and that this is just going to be a transformational time in the energy space. There will be a lot of scope, and this is, I think, where you guys and the students in particular I'm speaking to, but to apply frankly, some new creative approaches to doing institutions and to doing deployment of technologies that frankly other people may not have thought of. So thinking about new modes of transportation, how to kind of bring in IT, for example, is going to be one of the ways that we can address this.
On the resilient opportunities for our students and future generations of students. If you just listened to NPR this morning, there was a segment on resilience, and the Chief Resilience Officer of the state of Virginia was speaking about what they are planning to do. Talk about a cool job. Chief Resilience Officer not only of a locality, of states across the United States, of states across the world and different governments. This is the ultimate in development planning. How do you protect your gains and leverage opportunities? But I think these kind of jobs are brand new. Virginia just got a $120 million grant to build this resilience plan. That's not just one chief resilience officer, that's a whole staff working on that. So there are opportunities out there for our students and others who are thinking this way.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So I think now we have time to open it up for some questions, and Christina's going to walk around with the microphone. Is that right? Yeah.
Okay, well, I will ask the first question. My name is Leah. I'm a student at the School of Public Policy, studying environmental policy. I forgot, I think it was Dr. Patwardhan mentioned methane not being regulated. Was that you that mentioned it? Oh, no, it was Professor Hultman. Okay, you mentioned methane not being covered under the Clean Power Plan and how that's kind of like a gap. So with kind of the recent buzz about the animal agriculture industry's contributions to methane emission, I was wondering if you could kind of give me your opinion on that. Is there any room for regulations there? Is that something where we're kind of just going to have to like throw our hands up and be like, well, people like eating meat, so that's just going to continue?
Todd McGarvey, also a student here in the School of Public Policy. This question was for you, Professor Fisher. With respect to, I wondered if you could elaborate a bit further on where you see strategically civil society looking towards in light of this fissure you're sort of saying that may become based on tactics or who's let in, who's let out. Because I think I was in Paris as well, and you're right in that you get the very high level, the names in civil society are the ones that are let through the security gates. But in doing so, you're leaving out a lot of the conversation that they're not engaged in. So where do you possibly see civil society realigning and strategically engaging to get things done?
All right, let me talk methane briefly to answer Leah's question. And so good question. Let me speak at U.S. and then internationally. I think your question was specifically on ag, so agriculture. But let me mention in the U.S. We don't have the same regulatory tools for a lot of methane that we do for energy, and so it's harder to get a handle on non-CO2 gases. The hardest one, in some ways, the hardest major one is N2O, which is nitrous oxide, which is just difficult to address with a regulatory approach. Methane, we have a couple of options, and in fact, I should mention that the U.S. has taken a commitment to reduce by 40 to 45%, and then recently with Prime Minister of Canada, who announced a similar goal, we announced that we're going to regulate our existing source, oil and gas methane, which is our biggest chunk, which has been the kind of final arrow in the quiver for this administration on that front. So that's actually a big deal on our methane. But you asked about a slightly different methane source, which is one that is relevant to both our country but many other places, which is thinking about methane that comes from agriculture. And many places don't have good tools, just like we don't, to kind of regulate that. But that's where we have to look to both whatever regulatory tools are there, see what we can do at the national level with respect to that, but also then start to work on other approaches. And this is where this broader stakeholder engagement comes in, because you can actually look at solutions that might, for example, take smaller scale technologies like biodigesters and try to bring those to more widespread use in different development contexts. They can work. Similarly, thinking about agriculture practices even, and that's something that, again, is not an easy solution. You can't just sort of wave a wand and say, okay, there's a new regulation. You have to work with communities and work with governments and subnational governments and the actual actors, the actual farmers, to sort of see what models might work. So there's actually a whole stream of work in what's called climate smart agriculture. It's one of the several buzzwords around this, but that kind of track is one that's worth pursuing at the governmental level, but also in these other kind of dimensions. So I'll hand over to Dana for the other. Oh, I'm sorry. So, yeah.
Thanks for that question, Leah. I just wanted to add on to Nate's comment that at least in the U.S., we're also very deeply engaged with an international coalition called the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, which has a program on methane emissions from agriculture focused on providing funding for demonstration projects in areas of paddy rice, manure management, and enteric fermentation. And so all of the results of that are available online, and the idea is eventually to hope that this will be a scale-up for promising technologies. But in some areas, we don't have those technologies yet. So it's both about developing them and then hopefully scaling them up.
Could I just add in one other element to this, which is the consumer behavior? Because when I talk about market forces, we're not just talking about production forces, we're talking about consumer preferences. And here, the issue that I think you alluded to of industrial agriculture, and not just on the producing side, but on the consuming side, the gains that could be made if X percentage of a population in the United States shifted to vegetarianism as opposed to heavy beef consumption. We see certain trends in some countries go in one direction, in other countries go in another, just to have a systematic look at dietary preferences around the world and what part of this equation that could mean. Paul McCartney is very passionate on this issue and has an entire NGO, global NGO, based on promoting vegetarianism as a solution to the climate problem. I think that's actually very interesting. When you start talking movement-based, it's not just stopping governments from doing the wrong thing, but it's educating people about their health and about their preferences and how that impacts the world. So we need to look at all levels of this down to the individual.
I got my father to eat a fake chicken burger last week. I was very proud. We lied to him. And he ate the whole thing. But he said he wouldn't eat another one. So I mean, it's an interesting idea. So I'm not sure. I'm going to go back to Todd's question, though. It's a very important question here about whether civil society can realign strategically to get things done, was basically what you asked. But I'm not sure that civil society actors really are all in this kumbaya moment where they want to work together, really. I mean, there are the privileged few who have access and have a lot of resources. And what basically would need to happen to do this realignment would be for them to say, we should bring more people to the table, let's expand outward. And I'm not hopeful that that will happen. I mean, it's possible, but I think it's a lot more likely that there are going to be clashes among those who are the haves with access, the institutionalized few, and then those that represent probably the less institutionalized, more disenfranchised. We've seen that in the past, and I think that's where we're going with this. And the question will be if the most, privileged organizations continue to represent large swaths of the population, then that's okay, because they're still representing more people. But the problem will be if they start representing fewer people and more people who are mobilized are outside than inside, then we really should expect there to be clashes. So I think that we're coming to a point where something will happen, something will have to give, and I predicted that Paris was going to be when we would see it, but I did that before there was the terrorist attack, and that really changed the whole tenor of what was happening in Paris, as I'm sure you observed. But that was coming from Copenhagen right up to Paris, and then I don't think that because Paris is over and that there's agreement that will change the conversation. I think it's just the conversation is waiting for another day.
So kind of to add on to that, a lot of the, do I need to say, so I'm Nancy Hayden in the School of Public Policy. So I am curious, to what extent will corruption and the inability of some of the governing institutions all the way from the local, up in the developing world and even outside of the developing world, play into the ability to really meet the targets where you lack transparency and lack participation of civil society. Even when you have regulations in some of these countries, there's so many with just incredibly high corruption. How does that play into the success predictions?
Actually, my question is a nice follow-on to that. So the question is about the Green Climate Fund, and just to preface it a bit, the research my group does, we do climate modeling, we're looking at the Paris INDCs. The nation submitted two types of proposals, unconditional and conditional. The conditionals are vital, and they're conditional on technology flow and money flow. It's the electrification of Africa and India. How are we going to do that through the Green Climate Fund? How's the money going in? How's it going out? And how are we going to do it without having it stolen? Corruption.
Hi, I'm Amelia Avis. I'm an undergraduate government politics student. And mine was kind of going off of Leah's point about methane emissions. I know a big discussion in the environmental policy field domestically has been natural gas. And with the Clean Power Plan, there's been a lot of emphasis on it. And on one hand, it's a great economic boon for the United States, and also it has played a big part, switching from coal to natural gas has played a big part in the reduction of emissions. But on the other hand, there's the negative effects on the environment and the huge methane emissions that come from that. So for all the panelists, what should the United States move forward with natural gas, and should we use that as a way to reduce our carbon emissions despite the possible negative consequences?
So my question is also about civil society engagement, and I'm wondering how you think the structure of the UNFCCC itself limits civil society engagement, because, I mean, just reading the, I mean, I can't even talk about it without listing 30 acronyms, so I think it's really hard if you don't have access to get there. Even getting there, it's really hard to engage with. Sorry. Oh, okay. My name is Amelia. I'm a mechanical engineering major. But I was able to go to Lima with an NGO, and mostly what I heard there is if you can't get to COP repeatedly, then it's really hard to be engaged. So just being there your first time, it's almost impossible to engage because you spend your whole 2 weeks just learning the landscape. So I think that definitely limits engagement, especially for people from developing countries. It's hard enough to get there, let alone learning how to engage with that process your first time you're there. So, okay, rounding back around to my question, I was wondering how you think the UNFCCC structure itself needs to be changed in order to increase civil society engagement.
Thank you, Nate. That's a great question, Amelia. But for a second, I'm gonna answer your first question, and then I'm gonna say something that is relatively controversial. The first thing I would say is that actually the UNFCCC was originally designed to be extremely porous to civil society actors. It was one of the most porous of the environmental regimes that was formed at the Earth Summit back in 1992. And if you look at the participation rates for NGO observers starting in 1992 all the way through to more recently, it was very open, and there was a lot of opportunities for civil society actors to engage. However, it is highly technical and increasingly so. But here's the thing I'm going to say that a lot of people may not agree with is, why should civil society actors participate when their heads of state are negotiating? Or is that the place where civil society should be engaging, right? Because the question is, at that point, if each state is coming in with its position, perhaps the place where civil society should be engaging is it should be engaging to target its government prior to going and having a discussion and finalizing agreements. And I'm not sure that it's worth the carbon emissions. Yeah. I mean, and I hope that I'm not ending up going to be quoted as saying, Dana Fisher thinks civil society should not participate, because that is not the case. I'm not sure that that's the best way to have your voice heard. In a lot of ways, my research is finding that more and more the decisions are being made at the local, state, city level, and it's did you say trickling up, scaling up, whatever, scaling up till racing up, scaling. But anyway, so it's scaling its way up to these national positions. So in a lot of ways, once you get to these negotiations, so much of the deal is done that there are very few opportunities for your voice to be heard. In a lot of ways, I think that that's increasingly important to have your voice heard earlier on. And one of the best ways that citizens can express their voice right now, if I didn't already make this clear, is you should vote. And we have a primary coming up, but it's just like that is where it matters the most right now, in my opinion. And I'm not just talking for the federal elections, all the different people who are running, because that's where the change is going to happen.
I didn't know Dana was going to say it, but there she went. Which is that, you don't think about if there's a bill that's going to be passed in Congress, you don't think about like, I have to go to Congress today. Like some people do, but you don't think that that's the only way that you participate in the decision making. You don't have to go to physically into Congress and find a senator and like tell them what you think. Now, of course, you can, bless you. But it's not the only way people think. And the COP is different from that, but there's a way that what Dana said is also very, very true. The groundwork for the Paris COP, was laid by civil society movements for years before that, including the summit that Rob helped put together the year before, and a whole bunch of other kind of convenings that sort of helped create policies and orientations that countries took in with them ahead of time. I was working with the U.S. government for, frankly, 2 years in advance with, constantly trying to get stuff lined up so that when we walked through the door, at the Paris meeting, it wouldn't be done, but it would be a lot of the difficulties would have already been resolved. And this is one reason, for example, that we had frankly a year-long process of nations submitting their national targets, one of the key elements of the Paris outcome, but that happened in the year before Paris so that countries could actually kind of take the time they needed to vet and understand and sort of figure out what this all meant. Now that was just one example of several things that had to be landed, many things that had to be landed in Paris, but the point being to this very good question, that there are many ways to get involved in sort of steering or sort of engaging with this topic, and I'm not the expert in that, but I think that's a really good point to remember that there's this kind of, it's no longer just the COP as the decision points. Frankly, you know, we as the US, like we needed domestic constituency to execute on the stuff we wanted to do for Paris. Let me be very clear about that. We needed domestic constituency. We needed people to cover us for the stuff we were gonna do. We couldn't come out with a clean power plan and have all the environments come out and say it's horrible, right? We needed to make sure that it was gonna work with them. Because if they said it's horrible and everybody said our national target was horrible, it wasn't going to look constructive, right? That doesn't mean that we told them what to think, but it meant that we actually had to work with them well in advance of the Paris meeting in order to put the places we had to put in place before that time. So, anyway, that wasn't even what I was going to answer.
But it's good to see you feeling religion.
You guys know, you guys can get me worked up about the U.S. target setting process. Anytime, just ask me questions. Very briefly then, because, by the way, Jennifer, when is our time? Okay, let me be very brief then. The corruption question, I'm going to embed in a slightly bigger problem. I mean, so that's an important one. So national governments, many of them have different struggles, right? Sometimes they have struggles with corruption, but let's put it this way. A lot of countries put down a target and they have to implement it now. One of the obstacles to implementation is corruption. There are plenty of other obstacles to implementation. We heard about the Supreme Court in our country as being a potential obstacle to our implementation. Each of these obstacles has some specific remedies that we all know about. We know what needs to be done about certain corrupt practices, and that is kind of an ongoing conversation in that national situation about accounting and about governance that will have to happen for the countries in question. So that's one that I think is a good point to raise. I think the bigger point that sort of feeds from the joint questions here is about how countries can, in fact, deliver on the targets that they've set, right? And that is a big problem. I mean, I'm not saying it's not accomplishable, but that is a big challenge of the next 5 years, not only in our country, but in other countries. There is no international police state, right? We're not going to go after countries if they don't, hit their targets. So the only tool we have is transparency and, frankly, shaming, right? The only tool we have is to kind of say what countries are doing, say, are they tracking toward what they said they were going to do? Do we know where they are? Are they being transparent with their greenhouse gas accounting? Are they showing us where they are? Are they actually delivering the reductions that they said they would do to get them to their 2025 or 2030 target? And frankly, that is a job that is on all of us. It's not in the national governments. They're going to kind of try to say we're doing fine, right? And it's our job to say whether they are or not. So I think that's an important thing. There's a lot more to say about that, but I'll leave it there.
So just very quick responses since we're running out of time. To Nancy's question, I think the problem may not be as serious because if you really think about the mitigation challenge, if you can get it done in the 10 biggest emitters, you pretty much get it done there. And these countries are countries which have, there may be some variation, but these are big countries. They have reasonably robust systems in terms of what needs to happen. So I would not. On the GCF side, yes, it is worth remembering that the scale of resources required for doing clean electrification in India or in the rest of Africa will dwarf whatever the GCF can provide. So the GCF is really catalytic, but much of the rest of that financing is going to be private, national, and public finance. So in some ways, the GCF is sort of part of that bigger piece. It has obviously an important role, but it's not the only part of the financing piece. I just want to make one final point. A lot of the discourse around climate tends to be either couched in economic terms or in technical terms. It's either a problem with let's set the right price signal and so deal with the negative externality, or we have problems with technology, let's do clean technology. But there are other, I mean, as students of public policy, we know there are other bases for thinking about policy. There are normative bases, ethical bases, moral bases, and what was discussed earlier about diet. I think if we want to influence values, preferences, and consumer choices, we have to use other elements of that toolbox. It's not just about economics and technology, it's also about, you know, the moral case. So I'll leave it at that.
I think I'm going to start with the corruption as well. I think it's a piece of this equation that, as Nate said, transparency is where we're going to really get compliance at the nation-state level. We do have issues with leakage relating to corruption across the whole spectrum of issues. And it not only pollutes our politics, but the economic signals as well. Maybe the biggest source one of the biggest sources of corruption in the world is the massive amount of subsidies that go to fossil fuels currently creates massive amounts of money concentrated in very few policymakers' hands. And in those countries where they have taken on the very difficult issue of reducing massive subsidies, there have been some very interesting experiments in recent years. When the Nigerians lowered their subsidies for their oil production and put it into women's and children's health, the impacts on child and maternal deaths were quite clear, and I don't think this has all been fully studied and hasn't shaken all the way through yet, but you get massive social buy-in to the new use of that money, and it's not a huge pot of money that policymakers can direct to their friends or to someone else. It cleans up many systems all at once. So I would say the fossil fuel subsidies are a big issue for policy, but also a big issue relating to corruption, and making those linkages can get you into some pretty interesting terrain. Just one last point on the GCF. The Green Climate Fund is one of many vehicles, but it's the newest. It's the one that's linked to this stage of the negotiation, and therefore it is actually quite important what the GCF is when it grows up. I think that we need to avoid the mistake of thinking the GCF is the financing vehicle for all this. It's one of many. It's small, but if it is used in a very innovative way, and it really uses its public and private windows in a brand new way, and it doesn't function just like all the other funds, we could see some very innovative things. But I think we will have to keep the pressure on to make sure that the parties don't turn the GCF into just another vehicle.
I'm terrified of Professor Haddon, but I am going to make my one comment, which is in terms of thinking about corruption, though, one place where there are really great opportunities for civil society to participate is through thinking through these shifts away from fossil fuel and divestment campaigns. And all these campaigns exist on campuses, they exist at the state level, and they're amazing ways for people to actually get involved and have their voices heard well.
Okay, sorry. So this is a 5-second, 10-second answer. Okay, so somebody asked me about shale gas, and I just need to say, so methane in the U.S. it's very hard to answer in less than a couple of minutes, but we're going to have to deal with the gas issue. A lot of what we can do is tightening down the system with the regulations that I mentioned. It's a helpful kind of one-time sort of boost to our low-carbon economy, but we're going to have to go beyond that and very quickly with renewables, efficiency, electrification, and all this other stuff. So I'm happy to talk about that afterward if you're interested. But with that, I'm going to hand that down.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and I'm sorry to have to cut off such a rich discussion, but unfortunately we're already quite over time. So thank you so much for coming to this panel. Please join me in thanking the panelists as well for their remarks.